The sun bathed the park in a soft amber glow, projecting elongated shadows from the gently swaying trees onto the well-worn pathways. The distant laughter of children playing on the swings intertwined with the subtle chirping of birds. On a solitary bench near the edge of a tranquil pond, Morgan Blake sat silently, savoring a rare moment of quiet during the afternoon. Her black leather jacket lay folded beside her, exposing a strong build beneath a plain gray shirt and casual jeans. A faint scar on her forearm, visible under the sunlight, hinted at a past shaped by battles far from this peaceful setting. Morgan's eyes scanned her surroundings, driven more by ingrained habit than actual suspicion. A jogger passed by, offering a courteous nod, which she returned with subtlety. Her years as a Navy SEAL had honed her instincts, and even in retirement, her sharp awareness remained intact. The shuffling gait of a man a few yards away, and the lingering presence of a group of teens near the playground, all registered with her. Nothing seemed overtly alarming, yet an intangible tension hung in the air. Across the park, four men lounged near the base of an ancient oak tree, their harsh laughter piercing through the otherwise calm ambiance. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders clad in a black hoodie, leaned against the tree with a casual air of authority, his gaze sweeping over the park like a predator sizing up prey. Gary "Tank" Walker didn't blend in. His shaved head gleamed under the sunlight, and the faded tattoo trailing up his neck suggested a life spent on the fringes of society. He nudged a wiry man with a patchy beard beside him, motioning subtly toward Morgan. "That one," Tank muttered, his voice low but laced with malice. "Sitting there all smug, like she owns the place. Easy pickings," Patchy Beard snickered, cracking his knuckles. "Thinks she'll put up a fight?" Tank smirked, his grin sharp. "She'll try. They always do." Morgan felt their gaze before she saw them. A subtle prickle of awareness ran down her spine as her body instinctively tensed. Slowly, she turned her head, locking eyes with the group briefly. They didn't look away. Her first confirmation that they were trouble. Maintaining a relaxed demeanor, she draped one arm casually over the back of the bench, while the other rested lightly on her lap. Her breathing remained steady as her mind rapidly analyzed the situation. Four of them. The leader was muscular, the second wiry. The other two appeared younger, maybe early 20s, their cocky attitudes betraying overconfidence. The faint mix of cheap cologne and cigarettes drifting on the breeze confirmed their proximity. "All right, gentlemen," Morgan murmured under her breath, a faintly amused smile forming. "Let's see what you've got." The men started to move, their loud chatter disrupting the park's tranquility as they headed in her direction. Their laughter echoed across the playground, drawing a few curious glances from bystanders who quickly turned away, unwilling to get involved. Tank led the group, his steps deliberate and slow. Patchy Beard and the younger men flanked him like wolves circling prey. Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted subtly, her body language projecting just enough vulnerability to bait them closer. Her instincts told her these men thrived on exploiting fear. They had no idea who they were about to face. Tank stopped at the edge of the path near Morgan's bench, his boots crunching against the gravel. His smirk widened, revealing teeth stained by years of cigarettes and cheap coffee. Behind him, Patchy Beard let out a low chuckle, while the two younger men exchanged eager glances, barely containing their excitement. They spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around her. "Afternoon, ma'am," Tank began, his voice slick with feigned politeness. "Nice day to be sitting out here all by yourself, isn't it?" Morgan looked up slowly, her expression calm, her gaze narrowing slightly to show she wasn't intimidated. "It is," she replied evenly. "What do you want?" Tank chuckled, glancing back at his crew as if she'd made a joke. "Now, that's no way to greet a few friendly folks just stopping by for a chat. You got something against us saying hello?" Patchy Beard leaned in closer, his grin exposing yellowed teeth. "Or maybe she's one of those types, Tank, thinking she's too good to talk to us." Morgan didn't respond, her eyes flicking between them as she calculated distances and angles. They were close now, too close, close enough that any sudden movement would ignite the confrontation she knew was inevitable. "You hear me, lady?" Patchybeard's tone sharpened. "You think you're better than us?" One of the younger men, his face flushed with sunburn, sneered. "Bet she's one of those uppity ones, thinking this park belongs to her kind now." Morgan's jaw tightened, but her voice remained controlled. "I don't think anything belongs to me. I'm just sitting here, minding my business." "Oh, you hear that, boys?" Tank drawled as he stepped closer, his tone mocking. "She's just minding her business. Guess we'll mind it for her." He nodded toward the bag resting beside her on the bench. "That's a nice bag. Bet it's got something good inside. Why don't you hand it over, nice and polite? We wouldn't want things to get messy." Morgan's lips twitched into the faintest smirk. "Is that what you call polite these days? Stealing from people like me?" Tank's expression darkened, the mock civility vanishing for a moment. "Now, what's that supposed to mean?" Morgan's expression remained composed, but her tone sharpened as she responded with quiet defiance. "You know exactly what it means." Her voice, firm and steady, cut through the mocking laughter. "You didn't choose me because I'm alone. You picked me because you think I'm weak. An easy mark." The younger man stepped forward, his voice rising with irritation. "You've got a mouth on you, huh? Probably the same one you use to cry racism every time something doesn't go your way." Morgan stood, her movements deliberate and unhurried, the simple act commanding a presence they hadn't anticipated. Though shorter than Tank, her bearing exuded an air of quiet authority, the kind that only comes from facing far greater threats than this. Her unwavering gaze unsettled them, though none would admit it. "Do you really think this is going to play out the way you planned?" she asked, her voice steady, each word carrying weight. "Walk away while you still can." Patchybeard laughed nervously, his bravado cracking ever so slightly. "Look at her, trying to act tough. What are you going to do, lady? Call the cops? Like they'd bother showing up for someone like you." The two younger men, emboldened by their pack mentality, joined in his laughter. Their confidence swelled as Tank stepped closer, his expression hardening, the playful facade fading. The atmosphere grew heavy, the tension between them palpable. Morgan could feel the shift. This was no longer posturing. "I don't think you're hearing me," Tank said, his voice low and venomous. "We're taking that bag. Maybe we'll take something else too." Morgan's heart beat faster, but not with fear. Her body thrummed with anticipation. Her instincts, honed by years of training, kicked in as her mind calculated the scene. Distances, stances, vulnerabilities. Each of the men was a variable, a threat to be neutralized. Her SEAL training replayed in her head like a well-worn drill. Stay calm, take control, and strike decisively. Yet she held back, waiting. They hadn't crossed the final line. Not yet. Her hands, seemingly relaxed at her sides, subtly shifted, ready to act. Tank leaned closer, his voice now a menacing growl. "This isn't a game. Give us the damn bag, or we'll show you what happens when someone like you doesn't respect their betters." Morgan locked eyes with him, her tone like steel. "You're going to regret this." She gripped the strap of her bag firmly and stood, her body poised but her expression calm. The men sneered, mistaking her composure for fear. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, her voice steady as she said, "I've got somewhere to be." Without waiting for their response, Morgan began to walk. Her steps were measured, her breathing controlled, though her pulse quickened in anticipation. Running wasn't an option. It would only fuel their aggression. She moved forward, ignoring the taunts that followed, like the jeers of jackals closing in on their prey. "Hey, where are you going?" one of the younger men called, his voice laced with mockery. "We're not done talking to you, lady." Morgan kept her pace steady, scanning her surroundings. The park's main thoroughfare was ahead, but the path she had chosen now felt isolating, too far from the relative safety of the crowd. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel grew louder behind her, closing the distance. "Don't be like that," Patchybeard jeered, his voice tinged with menace. "Ain't you used to people like us talking to you? Or are you too good for that?" Morgan's jaw clenched, her resolve hardening. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly. She'd miscalculated. The clearing ahead was wide, open, and barren of cover. Worse, they'd outpaced her. Tank and the others now blocked her path, forming a loose semicircle. Tank stood at the center, his broad shoulders squared as he smirked, exuding overconfidence. "Well, look at you," he drawled, his voice thick with mock courtesy. "All cornered. Bet you didn't see this one coming." Morgan's eyes flicked to her rear. One of the younger men had circled back, cutting off her escape. She was surrounded, boxed in. Her body remained calm, but her mind raced, analyzing their positions and movements. Tank stepped forward, his grin widening. "You lost, sweetheart. This ain't your part of town." Morgan met his gaze, her voice unshaken. "I'm not lost. Now, if you'll step aside, I'll be on my way." Patchy Beard chuckled darkly, taking a step closer. "Oh, you think you can just walk out of here? Like we're gonna let you? Nah, lady, you don't get it. You don't belong here." Morgan's jaw tightened, but her face betrayed no emotion. "I don't want trouble," she said evenly. "Oh, we know you don't," Tank sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "People like you never do. Always acting like you're better than us. Taking up space like you're entitled to it." One of the younger men leaned away from the tree he had been resting against, pointing at Morgan. "Look at her, thinking she's better than us. You see that? The way she looks at us? Bet she's one of those types always crying racism when things don't go her way." Patchy Beard nodded, his tone sharpening. "Yeah, bet she's had it easy her whole life. Probably never worked for nothing. Just got everything handed to her 'cause of some pity party." Morgan's muscles coiled beneath her calm exterior as she waited for the inevitable moment to strike. Morgan exhaled sharply, her patience nearly gone. "You don't know a thing about me," she shot back, her voice cold and unwavering. Tank's smirk twisted into a sneer. "Oh, I know enough. You're just like the rest. Always looking for a handout, always expecting everyone else to step aside. Well, guess what? Not today." Morgan shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her stance. Her calm, steely gaze remained locked on him, her composure unbroken. "I've already warned you," she said, her tone firm. "Walk away now, and this ends here." Patchy Beard erupted in laughter, throwing his head back as if she'd told a joke. "Warn us! Hear that, Tank? She thinks she's in charge." His mocking tone echoed in the clearing. Tank's expression darkened, his voice losing its feigned civility. "You're not in charge of anything, lady," he growled, his tone heavy with menace. "You're going to hand over that bag, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you leave without a scratch." Morgan's sharp eyes darted between them, her instincts fully engaged. This wasn't about the bag. She knew that now. These men weren't interested in what she carried. They wanted dominance, to break her spirit, to make her feel small. Their goal wasn't theft, it was submission. Her voice cut through the tense air, steady and sharp. "You've had your chance." The words were barely out of her mouth when one of the younger men lunged at her. Morgan sidestepped with fluid precision, her movements deliberate and controlled. She didn't strike back, not yet. Years of SEAL training told her to act decisively, but she needed them to cross the line completely before retaliating. Tank's face contorted in anger as he barked, "What are you waiting for? Get her!" The order ignited the group. The same young man lunged again, this time with more force. Morgan moved instinctively, grabbing his arm mid-attack and twisting sharply. His own momentum worked against him, and he crashed to the ground with a pained yelp, clutching his arm in agony. The group froze, their smug confidence replaced by disbelief. Morgan turned her focus to the others, her stance calm but unyielding. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "I told you to walk away." Patchy Beard sneered, but hesitation crept into his movements. "Oh, you're going to regret that, lady," he spat. Tank stepped forward, towering over her, his large frame casting a shadow. "Think you're tough, huh? Let's see how long that lasts." He swung at her, a wide, uncoordinated blow meant to overwhelm her. Morgan ducked effortlessly, her body moving with practiced grace. Rising swiftly, she drove her elbow into his ribs, forcing him to stumble back. Tank clutched his side, grimacing in pain and fury. "Come on, all of you!" Tank barked, motioning to the others. "Take her down!" The remaining men advanced. Patchy Beard moved first, his fists raised as he swung wildly. Morgan deflected his strikes with calculated efficiency, each movement measured and deliberate. A quick, sharp kick to his knee sent him reeling, his balance faltering. Morgan capitalized on the opening, shoving him backward. He hit the ground with a heavy thud, cursing under his breath. One of the younger men, emboldened by the chaos, rushed at her. His approach was more cautious, but no less aggressive. Morgan stepped into his attack, blocking his swing and countering with a palm strike to his chest. The impact forced him to stagger backward, gasping for breath. Though he managed to stay upright, he glared at her, his face flushed with anger. "You're gonna pay for that," he growled, circling her warily. Morgan remained silent, her piercing gaze locked on him. Her body was poised, ready to react, the familiar adrenaline surging through her veins, sharpening her focus. Tank, having recovered, advanced again, his movements slower but more calculated. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat. "Think you can walk into our park and humiliate us?" Morgan turned to face him fully, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't your park, and I'm not the one humiliating anyone. You've done that to yourselves." Her words struck a nerve, and Tank's rage boiled over. He feinted left before throwing a punch aimed at her head. Morgan ducked and countered with a precise strike to his torso, followed by a low kick to his shin. Tank stumbled, barely maintaining his balance as he swung wildly again, more out of frustration than strategy. Morgan sidestepped with ease, forcing him to overextend. He nearly lost his footing. "Come on, Tank!" Patchy Beard shouted, struggling to rise. "Stop messing around!" Morgan caught movement from the corner of her eye. One of the younger men had armed himself with a tree branch, swinging it like a bat. She stepped inside his reach, grabbed the makeshift weapon, and twisted it from his grip. A quick shove sent him stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the gravel. Tank roared in frustration, charging at her with everything he had. This time, Morgan let him come closer. At the last second, she sidestepped and used his momentum to drive him into a nearby tree. The impact was solid, and Tank staggered, clutching the bark for support. Patchy Beard, emboldened by the brief distraction, lunged at her from behind. Morgan sensed his approach and spun, delivering a sharp elbow to his chest, followed by a firm push that sent him crashing back to the ground. The fight was relentless and chaotic, but Morgan's movements remained disciplined, her training evident in every calculated strike. Though her ribs ached from a poorly blocked punch and her forearm throbbed where the branch had grazed her, she pushed through the pain, her focus unwavering. Tank staggered back into the clearing, his face twisted with fury. "You think this is over?" he snarled, his voice filled with seething rage. Anger and desperation flared in Tank's voice as he spat. "You're going to regret this, lady. You're going to regret messing with us." Morgan straightened her posture, her breathing steady despite the exertion. Her voice, cold and sharp, cut through the air like ice. "No," she said firmly. "You're the one who's going to regret it." The remaining men, bruised and shaken, exchanged uncertain glances. Patchy Beard was slow to rise, his bravado visibly cracked, while one of the younger men began to back away, muttering under his breath about it not being worth the trouble. But Tank wasn't ready to concede. His pride, his ego, wouldn't let him back down. "You think you've won?" he snarled, his tone venomous. "You don't know what you've started." Morgan's eyes narrowed, her resolve unshaken. "Then let's finish it," she replied, her words steady and unwavering. Before either of them could act, a distant sound sliced through the tension, the faint wail of approaching sirens. The gang's heads turned sharply toward the noise, their expressions shifting from rage to uncertainty. "You hear that?" one of the younger men muttered, stepping back cautiously. "The cops are coming." "So what?" Tank barked, his frustration boiling over. "We're not done here." Patchy Beard, however, wasn't as resolute. He shifted uneasily, glancing between Tank and the direction of the sirens. "Look, man, this ain't worth it," he said hesitantly. "Shut up!" Tank growled, pointing a finger at him. "We don't run. We finish this." Morgan stood firm, her breathing controlled despite the ache spreading through her ribs. She watched the fractures forming in their unity, the confidence that had bolstered them earlier now crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights flickering through the trees like a warning beacon. "Tank! one of the younger men said again, more urgently now. "She's not worth it." "Let's go." Tank turned back to Morgan, his eyes blazing with fury and frustration. He took a step toward her, his fists trembling as though caught between his pride and the reality of the approaching police. For a moment, it seemed he might press forward. Consequences be damned. But then the sirens grew sharper, the lights drawing closer, their urgency impossible to ignore. "Damn it!" Tank cursed, his voice cracking with rage. He shot Morgan a glare filled with venom. "This ain't over." Morgan's voice remained cold and precise. "Yes, it is." With a growl of frustration, Tank turned sharply on his heel, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's go! Move!" Patchy Beard didn't hesitate, limping after Tank with a grimace. The younger men exchanged one last glance at Morgan, their faces a mix of anger and unease, before trailing behind their leader. One of them muttered under his breath, "She's crazy!" As they disappeared into the shadows of the trees, Morgan stayed rooted in place, her body still coiled with tension. She tracked the sound of their retreating footsteps and scanned the clearing, ensuring none of them doubled back. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to exhale. The sirens were nearly upon her now. Moments later, the crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of law enforcement. 2 squad cars pulled up at the edge of the clearing, their lights painting the trees in bursts of red and blue. The officers stepped out cautiously, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. A tall officer, his tone clipped with authority, approached Morgan. "Ma'am, are you okay? We got a call about a disturbance in the park." Morgan nodded, her tone even despite the lingering adrenaline. "I'm fine. They're gone now." The officer's eyes lingered on her, taking in the scrape on her arm and the subtle tension in her posture that betrayed the pain she was suppressing. "Did they hurt you?" Morgan shook her head. "Nothing I can't handle." Another officer scanned the area, his eyes landing on the disturbed dirt and items left behind. A hat from one of the younger men and a discarded tree branch. "Looks like they took off in a hurry," he noted to his partner. The first officer sighed and pulled out a notepad. "Can you describe them?" Morgan hesitated, the events of the past minutes replaying in her mind. The adrenaline ebbed, replaced by the dull ache of bruises and the sharp sting of her arm. "4 of them," she began. "Mid-20s, mostly. The leader, tall, shaved head, tattoos on his neck, calls himself Tank." The officer nodded, jotting down her description. "Did they say anything? Anything to suggest why they targeted you?" Morgan's jaw tightened, the echoes of their hateful words still fresh in her mind. The mockery, the slurs, the thinly veiled malice. She chose her words carefully. It wasn't random. They knew exactly what they were doing. The officer's pen paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. "Meaning?" Morgan met his gaze with steady resolve. "Meaning they've done this before, and they'll do it again." The officer's expression hardened as he finished taking notes. "We'll keep an eye out for them. In the meantime, we'd like you to come down to the station and file a formal report." Morgan nodded slowly. "I'll meet you there." As the officers returned to their vehicles, Morgan took a moment to steady herself. The clearing was quiet again, but the weight of what had happened lingered heavily in the air. Tank's parting words weren't just a threat, they were a challenge, and Morgan had no intention of backing down. Later, the fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly overhead as Morgan sat across from Officer Reyes. Her expression was calm, but her body still thrummed with residual adrenaline. The confrontation at the park had ended, but the echoes of the men's words lingered. Their hatred had been unmistakable. She replayed the encounter in her mind. Not just the physical fight, but the taunts, the sneers, and the pointed reminders of why they'd chosen her. Officer Reyes, a young man with a focused demeanor, studied her closely. With a no-nonsense demeanor, Officer Reyes flipped open his notebook, his pen poised. "Let's start from the top, Miss Blake. You said there were 4 men, and their leader called himself Tank. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Morgan recounted the events in sharp, precise detail. She described Tank's mocking tone, the hateful remarks, and the way the men circled her like predators. As her story unfolded, Reyes's pen moved quickly, his expression darkening with every word. When she finished, he tapped the pen against his notebook thoughtfully. "This doesn't sound random." "Are you sure you've never seen these men before?" "I'm sure," Morgan replied, her tone firm. "They weren't after my bag. That was just an excuse. They saw me sitting alone and thought I'd be an easy target. They wanted to intimidate me, to make me feel out of place." Reyes frowned and leaned back in his chair. "Why do you think they singled you out?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "Because I'm black." Reyes's pen froze midair. "They said that?" Morgan's jaw tightened. Not directly at first, but it was clear in everything they said. Comments about me thinking I'm better than them, how people like me don't belong. This wasn't just about stealing. They wanted to humiliate me. Reyes sighed, closing his notebook with a faint snap. "We've had reports of harassment like this recently. Minor incidents in public spaces, mostly. But if this group is targeting people based on race," he trailed off, his frustration evident. "They are," Morgan said firmly, "and they've been doing it for a while. They were too comfortable, too confident. This wasn't their first time." Reyes leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I'll run their descriptions through the system and cross-reference recent reports. But I'll be honest with you, Miss Blake, cases like this are hard to pin down. Without solid evidence or victims pressing charges, it's tough to make anything stick." Morgan's voice was sharp. "Then find the evidence, because I'm not letting this slide." Hours later, Morgan sat in her living room, her laptop casting a faint glow in the dim light. She wasn't the type to sit idly by and hope for justice. Her military training had taught her to take initiative. If Reyes needed more proof, she'd find it herself. It didn't take long for a disturbing pattern to emerge. Over the past 6 months, there had been multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults across the area. Every case involved groups of men targeting individuals in public spaces, and every victim was a person of color. Morgan's jaw clenched as she read through the accounts. The descriptions of the attackers were eerily consistent. A tall, broad-shouldered man with neck tattoos, flanked by younger accomplices. Tank. Many victims hadn't pressed charges, likely out of fear or frustration with the system. But their accounts all carried the same undertone. The attacks weren't just about theft. They were meant to send a message. Digging deeper, Morgan found a community forum where locals discussed similar incidents. One thread stood out. "These guys aren't random thugs. They target minorities. They pick their spots, intimidate people, and get out fast. Nobody ever catches them." Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her attention away. It was a message from Sarah Carter, her best friend and an investigative journalist known for chasing difficult stories. "Heard about what happened. You okay? Call me." Morgan didn't hesitate. She hit the call button, and Sarah answered on the first ring. "Morgan? I saw the news. What happened?" Morgan explained everything. The attack, the hateful remarks, and the troubling patterns she'd uncovered. Sarah was silent for a moment before responding, her voice grim. "It sounds like this isn't just some group of punks. If they're this organized and specifically targeting minorities, this could be a hate group." "That's exactly what it is," Morgan replied, "and I'm not letting them get away with it." Sarah sighed. "I get it. But these people are dangerous, Morgan. If you dig too deep, they came after me because they thought I'd back down." Morgan interrupted. "That I'd just let it happen. They were wrong." There was a pause before Sarah spoke again, her tone resigned but supportive. "What do you need?" "Anything you can find," Morgan said. "Where they hang out, how long they've been doing this, why the police haven't stopped them. Anything." Sarah hesitated. "I'll see what I can do. But promise me you'll be careful. People like this don't take kindly to being exposed." Morgan didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on her laptop screen. The faces of Tank and his crew burned into her memory. Finally, she said, "I'll be careful, but this ends now." The next morning, Morgan sat at her dining table, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand. Her laptop screen glowed faintly as she reviewed the files Sarah had sent overnight. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed to life. Children playing, dogs barking, the hum of a distant lawnmower. It was a stark contrast to the dark truths she was uncovering. Sarah's documents painted a clearer picture of Tank's gang and their activities. This wasn't a random group of thugs terrorizing public spaces. They were part of a loosely organized network operating under the radar, targeting minorities with calculated precision. The evidence was damning. The incidents weren't isolated, they were coordinated. Assaults, vandalism, and intimidation tactics aimed at driving fear into specific communities. And there were whispers of someone above Tank, a figure pulling the strings. Morgan's jaw tightened as she reviewed the files again. Every report, every detail confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a campaign of terror, and Tank and his crew were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Her resolve hardened. If they thought she'd let this slide, they were sorely mistaken. Morgan's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Officer Reyes. "Blake," she answered, her tone sharp. "Morning," Reyes said, his voice tight, as though sleep had been a luxury he couldn't afford. "I've been looking into the names you gave me. You were right. This Tank guy isn't just some random punk. He's tied to a string of incidents. His group's been causing trouble for months." "I could have told you that," Morgan replied curtly. "What are you doing about it?" "That's the problem," Reyes admitted, his frustration evident. "Most of the victims didn't press charges, so there's no official paper trail. It's hard to connect everything legally." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Then make a trail," she snapped. "If I can dig up this much on my own, you have the resources to dig deeper. Don't tell me your hands are tied." Reyes sighed heavily. "Look, I want to take these guys down as much as you do, but without solid evidence, anything we do could fall apart in court. If they walk, it's over." Morgan hated the endless bureaucracy of the justice system, the hoops, the red tape, all while people like Tank operated unchecked. "So, what's your plan?" "There's a rumor," Reyes said, hesitating slightly, "that Tank's crew might be connected to a larger network. We're talking hate crimes, maybe even domestic terrorism. If that's true, the feds might get involved." Morgan leaned forward, her voice cold. And that means we need something concrete before we can escalate it," Reyes explained. "We're working on it, but it's going to take time." Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. Time wasn't a luxury she was willing to afford men like Tank. "I'll do my part," she said finally, "but you better be ready when I bring you something." "Don't do anything reckless, Blake," Reyes warned, his voice weary. Morgan hung up without answering. That evening, Morgan sat in a dimly lit coffee shop across town. Across the table, Sarah Carter looked equally exhausted and determined, her laptop open and notes scattered around her. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said, sliding a folder toward Morgan. "Tank's gang is just one piece. There are at least 3 other groups like his operating in the area. Different names, different tactics, but the same goal: intimidation." Morgan flipped through the folder, her frown deepening as she absorbed the information. Photos of graffiti, mug shots, and maps dotted with red circles marking incidents. It was all too organized to be a coincidence. "This isn't just about harassment," Morgan muttered, her voice low. "They're trying to push people out, make them feel unsafe in their own neighborhoods." Sarah nodded grimly. "And they've been getting away with it. The incidents are small enough to avoid national attention, and nobody's connecting the dots." Morgan's mind raced, piecing the fragments together. If they could identify who was pulling the strings above Tank, they could unravel the entire operation. "What about funding?" Morgan asked, flipping back to a map. "This isn't just a few angry men with too much time on their hands. Someone's backing them." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "That's the tricky part. There's talk of private donations, maybe even ties to certain organizations, but nothing concrete yet." Morgan leaned back, arms crossed, her jaw set. "Then we go after Tank. He's the weak link. If we can turn him, he might lead us to whoever's running this." Sarah hesitated. "That's risky. You know he's not going to just roll over." Morgan's expression hardened. "Then we'll make him. If Reyes won't push hard enough, I will." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Morgan raised a hand. "I know what I'm doing. I didn't survive everything I've been through just to let men like him win." Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly, her expression softening. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. Careful doesn't win wars. The city was quiet as Morgan moved through its shadowy edges, her presence unnoticed. The soft hum of distant traffic accompanied her as she approached the seedy bar Sarah had flagged in her research. It was the kind of place where bad intentions lingered, like cigarette smoke, a dimly lit dive on the outskirts of town. Morgan stopped just short of the entrance, blending into the shadows as she assessed the scene. Two men stood near the door, chatting in low voices. Their posture was guarded, defensive, though they didn't look like Tank's crew. Still, appearances could be deceiving. Adjusting her cap to obscure her face, Morgan slipped inside without drawing their attention. The bar's interior was dark and claustrophobic, its air thick with stale smoke and spilled beer. Morgan's eyes adjusted quickly as she scanned the room. It didn't take long to spot Patchy Beard, seated in a booth with one of the younger men from the park. They were hunched over their drinks, their conversation animated. Neither noticed as Morgan moved toward the bar. The bartender, a wiry man with a face like weathered leather, glanced up as she approached. "What'll it be?" "Information," Morgan said quietly, sliding a $20 across the counter. "I'm looking for someone. Big guy, shaved head, neck tattoos. Goes by Tank." The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the booth where Patchy Beard sat. "Never heard of him." Morgan slid another bill across the counter. "You sure?" He hesitated, glancing toward the booth again before leaning in. "They were here earlier. Left." Morgan slipped the bartender another bill, keeping her tone steady. "Thanks." She left the bar as silently as she'd entered, her mind racing. The warehouse on Fletcher Street was in the industrial district, a sprawling maze of abandoned buildings and forgotten machinery. If Tank had retreated there, it meant he was running out of options. That also meant he might be cornered. And cornered men were always dangerous. An hour later, Morgan crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, her eyes locked on a dimly lit warehouse in the distance. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wind against its decaying walls. Through the shattered windows, she spotted shadows shifting against the faint glow of a single light overhead. Her instincts told her this was the right place. Tank's crew wasn't big enough to maintain a fully guarded hideout, but she knew better than to expect an unprotected one. Two figures stood near the main entrance, their postures tense. The faint orange glow of a cigarette briefly illuminated one of their faces, and Morgan recognized him as one of the younger men from the park. The other man, unfamiliar but broad-shouldered, looked equally capable of trouble. Morgan inhaled deeply, steadying herself as she formulated her plan. Getting inside undetected was crucial, but she also needed leverage. Tank wouldn't give up any information willingly, and she couldn't rely on threats alone. Circling to the side of the warehouse, Morgan spotted a broken window partially hidden by overgrown bushes. She tested the frame cautiously, grimacing at the faint creak it emitted. Sliding through, she landed soundlessly on the cracked concrete floor, immediately crouching low to stay out of sight. The interior of the warehouse was as grimy and dilapidated as she'd expected. The air was thick with the stench of oil and decay, the walls streaked with years of grime. Distant voices carried through the cavernous space, drawing Morgan forward. She stayed within the shadows, her movements as silent as a ghost. Tank's voice cut through the quiet, a low growl that commanded attention. "I told you, we lay low until this blows over. No more park jobs, not until I say so." Patchy Beard's voice responded, tinged with frustration. "You're acting like we can just sit on our hands. People are asking questions." "Let them ask," Tank snapped. "We don't move until I say so. End of discussion." Morgan crept closer, her heart steady as she reached a vantage point behind a stack of crates. From there, she could see Tank standing near a makeshift table, his imposing frame cast in the dim overhead light. Patchy Beard and another man sat nearby, their body language tense. A few others lingered in the shadows, indistinct but present. Morgan quickly pulled out her phone and typed a message to Sarah. "Found him. Warehouse on Fletcher. Call Reyes now." As she hit send, Morgan adjusted her stance, preparing for the next step. She wasn't leaving without answers, but she wasn't reckless enough to take on Tank's crew alone. Then, her voice sliced through the tense silence. "Tank." The room froze. Every head turned toward her, their faces shifting from surprise to recognition. Tank stepped forward, his expression darkening. "You," he growled. Morgan straightened, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "We're going to have a conversation." Tank let out a low, menacing laugh. "You think you can just walk in here and start making demands?" Morgan's voice was as cold as steel. I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know. Because if you don't, this place will be swarming with cops in less than 5 minutes. Tank's smirk faltered briefly before he recovered, though the tension in his crew was palpable. You don't scare me. You should be, Morgan replied, stepping closer, her calm demeanor cutting through the bravado in the room. Tank's crew exchanged uneasy glances, the earlier confidence that had emboldened them now faltering. Morgan's presence filled the room, her every step deliberate. You've got guts, Tank said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain his composure. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered. Morgan's eyes scanned the room, counting 5 men, including Tank. She didn't flinch. Outnumbered? I've seen worse. And guess what? They didn't win either. Tank's fists clenched at his sides. Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero? No, Morgan said, her tone cutting. I'm just the one who's going to make sure you answer for what you've done. Before Tank could respond, the faint wail of police sirens reached the warehouse. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the flashing blue and red lights that painted the grimy walls in shifting colors. Tank's smirk dropped entirely, replaced by a look of genuine alarm. You called the cops? Patchy Beard spat, his voice rising in panic. He glanced toward the exit, his instincts screaming at him to run. Morgan's voice remained steady, unshakable. You think I came here without a plan? It's over. Don't let her scare you, Tank barked, though his voice cracked under the weight of his own uncertainty. We've handled worse than this. Morgan stepped closer, her words slicing through his bravado. Have you? Because from where I'm standing, you're about to lose everything. Outside, the crunch of tires on gravel was followed by the slamming of car doors and the muffled voices of officers approaching. Tank's crew shifted uneasily, looking to him for direction. Tank, what do we do? One of the younger men whispered, his tone urgent. Tank turned on him, his frustration boiling over. Shut up! Shut up and stay put! We're not running! Tank snarled, his face twisting with frustration. Morgan's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. You don't have to run, but you will face the consequences. Patchy Beard, his nerve finally snapping, bolted toward the back exit. Morgan moved like a flash, intercepting him before he could reach the door. Grabbing his arm, she twisted it behind his back with practiced precision, forcing him to his knees. He let out a panicked yelp, his bravado crumbling in an instant. You're not going anywhere, Morgan said evenly, her grip firm. Tank and the others froze, their hesitation buying just enough time for the officers outside to act. The front doors burst open with a crash, and a team of police stormed in, their weapons drawn but their voices calm and commanding. Police! Hands in the air! One officer barked. Tank's face twisted in rage, but after a brief moment of resistance, he reluctantly raised his hands. The younger men followed suit, their fear outweighing their loyalty to their leader. Within moments, the officers moved in, restraining the group and securing them in handcuffs. Morgan released Patchy Beard, stepping back as an officer took over. She straightened, her sharp gaze fixed on Tank as he was pulled to his feet. You think this changes anything? Tank snarled, his bravado faltering. You think you've stopped us? Morgan stepped closer, her voice low and firm, audible only to him. You're done. The people you've hurt, the fear you've spread, it ends here. And if there's anyone above you, I'll find them too. Tank's glare faltered, his defiance now a hollow shell. The officers led him and his crew out of the warehouse, their voices fading as they escorted the group to waiting squad cars. Officer Reyes approached Morgan, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. You weren't kidding when you said you'd bring us something concrete. Morgan crossed her arms, her posture unyielding. You've got them now. Don't let them slip through the cracks. Reyes nodded. We'll make sure they don't. You've done more than your part here, Blake. Morgan's eyes lingered on the warehouse, her thoughts racing. Finally, she spoke. This isn't over. Tank's just a piece of the puzzle. Someone bigger is pulling the strings, and I'm going to find them. Reyes frowned. We'll do what we can, but don't go after them alone. You've already done enough. Morgan gave him a small, cold smile. We both know I don't stop halfway. As the officers cleared the scene, Morgan turned and walked away. The faint chill of the night air brushed against her face. Tank and his crew were in custody, But the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The dim glow of Morgan's laptop illuminated her face as she leaned forward, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. It was well past midnight, but the adrenaline from Tank's capture still coursed through her veins. The warehouse bust had been a victory, but she knew it was just one step in a much larger battle. Across from her, Sarah sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through documents on her tablet. Exhaustion dulled her sharp wit, but the determination in her eyes mirrored Morgan's resolve. "Reyes confirmed they're keeping Tank in holding for now," Sarah said, not looking up. "But if they don't get something solid to charge him with, he'll lawyer up and walk." "He's not walking," Morgan replied firmly. "Not if we can prove he's tied to the larger network." Sarah frowned, her fingers pausing mid-scroll. "It won't be easy. These groups are careful, decentralized. Nobody has all the pieces. That's why we focus on Tank," Morgan countered. "He knows more than he's letting on. We just need to make him talk." "And if he doesn't?" Sarah asked, her brows furrowed. Morgan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we find another way. Someone in his crew knows something. Patchy Beard, one of the younger guys. They're followers, not leaders. They'll crack before he does." The next morning, Morgan met Reyes at the police station. The atmosphere was tense, phones ringing, and quiet conversations buzzing in the background. Reyes led her down a quiet hallway to the interrogation rooms. "Tank's in there," he said, nodding toward a door with a small observation window. "He hasn't said much, just a lot of posturing." Morgan folded her arms. "Let me talk to him." Reyes hesitated, his skepticism clear. "You sure? He's the type to try and get under your skin." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "He can try. It won't work." Reyes opened the door, and Morgan stepped inside. Tank sat at the metal table, his broad shoulders hunched as he leaned back in the chair. His wrists were cuffed, but his expression was one of smug defiance. As she entered, he smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Well, if it isn't Wonder Woman, they send you in to finish what you started?" Morgan pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "You're in a lot of trouble, Tank." He laughed hollowly. "Trouble, lady? This is a hiccup. I'll be out of here before you finish your coffee." "Not this time," Morgan said, her voice steady. "Your crew's already folding. Patchy Beard's singing like a bird. The younger guys, they're scared. It's only a matter of time before they give us everything we need." Tank's smirk faltered, just for a second, before he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "You're bluffing." Morgan didn't flinch. "Try me." Tank's jaw tightened, his frustration evident as he snapped, "Shut up and stay put." "We're not running!" Morgan's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unyielding. "You don't have to run, but you will face the consequences." Patchy Beard, his nerve finally shattering, bolted toward the back exit. Morgan moved instantly, intercepting him before he could escape. With practiced precision, she grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back and forcing him to his knees. His bravado dissolved into a panicked yelp. "You're not going anywhere," Morgan said evenly, her grip firm and unwavering. The commotion froze Tank and the others, their hesitation buying enough time for the officers outside to make their move. The warehouse doors burst open with a resounding crash as uniformed police officers stormed in, weapons raised, but their commands clear and authoritative. "Police! Hands in the air!" one officer barked. Tank's face twisted with rage, but after a tense pause, he reluctantly raised his hands. The younger men, their fear overwhelming their loyalty, quickly followed suit. Within moments, the officers moved in, securing the crew in handcuffs. Morgan released Patchy Beard, stepping back as an officer took over. She straightened, her sharp gaze fixed on Tank as he was hauled to his feet. "You think this changes anything?" Tank growled, his voice low but laced with defiance. "You think you've stopped us?" Morgan stepped closer, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "You're done. The fear you've spread, the people you've hurt, it ends here. And if there's anyone above you, I'll find them too." Tank glared at her, his bravado thinning to a hollow shell. The officers led him and his crew out, their voices fading as they were escorted to the waiting squad cars. Officer Reyes approached, his expression a mix of respect and relief. You weren't kidding when you said you'd deliver something solid. Morgan crossed her arms, her stance unwavering. You've got them now. Don't let them slip through the cracks. Reyes nodded firmly. We'll make sure they don't. You've done more than your part here, Blake. Morgan's gaze lingered on the warehouse, the echoes of the confrontation still fresh. This isn't over, she said finally. Tank's just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone bigger pulling the strings, and I'm going to find them. Reyes frowned, his tone cautious. We'll do what we can, but don't go after them alone. You've already done enough. Morgan offered a small, cold smile. We both know I don't stop halfway. As the officers finished clearing the scene, Morgan turned and walked into the night, the chill brushing against her face. This victory was significant, but the battle wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Later that night, Morgan sat in the precinct's conference room, now transformed into a war room. The sterile walls were covered in printouts, photos, and maps, all connected by red strings pinned to a corkboard. At the center was Paul Hendrick's name, circled in bold black marker. Officers moved around the room, cross-referencing files and reports. Reyes stood by the board, briefing the team. This is where it gets tricky, Reyes said, pointing to a cluster of pins marking Hendrick's businesses. On paper, everything looks clean. His construction companies are legitimate, at least on the surface. But thanks to Tank's testimony and Morgan's intel, we know they're being used to fund and coordinate these hate groups. Sarah, seated in the corner with her laptop, raised a hand. I've tracked some unusual financial activity tied to Hendrick. There are shell companies moving money between accounts, donations to political organizations with extremist ties. It's subtle, but it's there. Reyes nodded, his jaw tightening. Subtle isn't enough for a warrant. We need something concrete. Bank statements, communications, anything that ties him directly to these groups. Morgan folded her arms, her expression grim. What about the crew we picked up? Tank gave us Hendrick's name. Patchy Beard and the others must know something. They're scared, Reyes admitted. Flipping on Hendrick has them rattled. They know how dangerous he is. Morgan stepped forward, her tone firm. Then we push harder. Hendrick isn't going to stop unless we act, and more people will get hurt if we don't. Later that day, Morgan sat across from Patchy Beard in an interrogation room. The man's confidence had evaporated, replaced by nervous energy. He shifted constantly in his seat, his eyes darting from Morgan to the mirror on the wall. You don't get it, he said, his voice shaky. Paul's got connections. Big ones. If he finds out I talked, Morgan interrupted, her voice calm but cutting. What? You think he'll protect you? Men like Hendrick don't stick their necks out for people like you. They use you. Patchy Beard's hands fidgeted on the table. I didn't think it'd go this far. The park stuff, the harassment. It was supposed to just scare people. But Paul's always had bigger plans. Morgan leaned in, her gaze sharp. What plans? Patchy Beard hesitated, the weight of his decision visible on his face. Finally, he exhaled heavily. He's using us to stir up chaos. Fear makes people easy to control, you know? Paul's got ties to groups that want to push laws, policies, stuff that benefits them. We're just the boots on the ground. Morgan's stomach churned, but her face betrayed no emotion. And the funding? How does it work? Patchy Beard's voice dropped lower. He launders it through the construction companies, sends the money to shell accounts, and it gets funneled to the crews. We get a cut for doing the dirty work. From behind the observation glass, Reyes stepped into the room, a file in hand. He set it on the table. That's enough to start connecting the dots, he said, but we'll need you to testify. Patchy Beard froze, panic flashing in his eyes. Testify? Are you crazy? Paul will have me killed. Not if we take him down first, Morgan said firmly. Help us, and we'll make sure you're protected. Back in the conference room, Morgan, Reyes, and Sarah pored over the new information. The financial trail Patchy Beard described aligned with Sarah's findings, creating a clearer picture of Hendrick's operations. This is the break we needed, Sarah said, scrolling through her laptop, her voice laced with determination. We can tie the money directly to Tank's crew and a few other groups operating in neighboring counties. With the paper trail and Tank's testimony, it's enough to get a search warrant. Reyes nodded, his expression resolute. I'll get the paperwork filed. Once we have the warrant, We'll raid Hendricks' main office. Morgan's jaw tightened. This isn't just about arresting him. We need to dismantle everything. His network, his funding, his influence. If we don't, someone else will just step in to take his place. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Morgan's arm. One step at a time. Taking Hendrick down is the first step. The warrant was approved faster than expected. By evening, Morgan stood with Reyes and a team of officers outside Hendrick's sleek office building. Its gleaming glass facade stood in stark contrast to the corruption festering inside. The team moved swiftly, securing the premises as they entered. Inside, Morgan watched as officers combed through files, computers, and desk drawers. Sarah had joined the operation as an observer, snapping photos and taking notes for her eventual exposé. Reyes emerged from an office holding a thick binder, his face triumphant. "This is it," he said, lifting the binder. "Transaction records, emails, it's all here. Hendrick is done." Morgan allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, but the gravity of the situation tempered her relief. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Hendrick's arrest is a win, but dismantling his network is the real goal." Hours later, Morgan sat in the precinct's dimly lit conference room. A map of the city was spread across the table, dotted with red and blue pins marking the locations of incidents tied to Tank's crew and other groups. Parks, alleys, and small businesses each represented another neighborhood terrorized by Hendrick's network. Reyes shuffled through a stack of files, his brow furrowed. "This is bigger than we thought," he said, sliding a file toward Morgan. "Hendrick's name keeps coming up, but it's always indirect. Donations to questionable organizations, funding businesses that mysteriously fail after trouble starts in their neighborhoods. He's careful, keeps himself insulated." Morgan leaned over the map, her eyes tracing the web of connections. Careful isn't untouchable. He's left a trail. We just need to pull it together. Sarah entered the room, a laptop under her arm and determination in her eyes. She set the laptop on the table and spun it toward them. "I've been digging into Hendrick's financials. On paper, everything looks legitimate. Construction, consulting, community development. But the timing lines up with the start of these incidents. He's funneling money to these groups under the guise of donations." Reyes frowned as he flipped through the documents. "If we can prove the money is financing hate groups, this becomes a federal case. But circumstantial evidence isn't enough." Morgan leaned back, her mind racing. "Then we go after his people. Tank might not know much beyond his orders, but someone in Hendrick's circle does. He's not doing this alone." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying over her keyboard. "If we can find out who's handling the logistics, fund transfers, meeting locations, that might give us what we need." Later that evening, Morgan and Reyes sat in an unmarked car outside a nondescript office building downtown. The harsh glow of fluorescent lights spilled onto the sidewalk, casting long shadows across the empty street. "This building might be a hub for Hendrick's operations," Morgan said, her voice low. "We're not going in without backup," Reyes replied, his tone firm. Morgan kept her eyes on the building. "We're not going in at all, yet. We watch, gather intel, and follow anyone who looks important." Reyes cast her a skeptical glance. "You really think someone's going to lead us straight to Hendrick?" Morgan's voice was steady. "They always do. Everyone makes a mistake eventually." Hours passed in tense silence, their patience finally rewarded when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the entrance. A well-dressed man in his 40s stepped out, glancing around nervously before entering the building. "That's Thomas Kane," Morgan said, her eyes narrowing. "One of Hendrick's top guys, handles the financials." Reyes reached for his radio. "We tail him when he leaves. If he's meeting Hendrick, we'll know soon enough." The tail led them to an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. From a discreet distance, Morgan and Reyes watched as Kane entered, and was greeted warmly by a man in a tailored suit. "That's him," Morgan murmured, her gaze locked on the man. "Paul Hendrick." The two men were seated at a private table near the back, their conversation obscured behind thick glass and layers of privacy. "This is it," Reyes said, already coordinating surveillance over his radio. "We get audio and visual. If they say anything incriminating, we've got him." Hours later, back at the precinct, the recordings played on a monitor. Hendrick's voice was calm and measured, but his words were damning. "We need to keep the pressure up in those neighborhoods," Hendrik said, his tone cold. "If they feel unsafe, they'll leave. Once they're gone, we move in. Cheap property, big profits." Kane's response was quieter, but equally incriminating. "What about the crews? They're getting reckless." "Then we replace them," Hendrik replied sharply. "These are tools, nothing more. As long as they get the job done, I don't care what happens to them." The room was silent as the recording ended. Reyes turned to Morgan, his expression grim. "That's enough to bring him in." Morgan's gaze remained fixed on the monitor, her voice firm. "It's enough to end this." Morgan stood in the center of the precinct's operations room, her arms crossed as the officers moved into action. Hendrik's arrest was imminent, but Morgan knew this wasn't just about taking down one man. This was about dismantling an entire system built on fear and manipulation. "Let's finish this," she said, her resolve unwavering. As Reyes and Sarah spread out the documents and photos on the table, Paul Hendrik's name loomed like a dark shadow over everything. The evidence Reyes had pulled overnight painted a troubling picture. A respected businessman on the surface, but with deep ties to extremist groups that could no longer be ignored. "We've got a lot of circumstantial evidence," Reyes said, gesturing to the photos and financial reports spread out before them. "Connections to fringe groups, suspicious payments through his shell companies, but nothing solid enough to take him down." "He's careful," Sarah added, scrolling through her laptop. "Everything about his public image screams respectability. Charitable donations, community projects, clean records. But these payments? They're too clean. Almost like someone went out of their way to hide something." Morgan leaned forward, her eyes scanning the financial reports. She traced her finger along one of the entries. "These payments? They're too consistent. Same amount, same intervals. That's not charity. That's funding." Sarah nodded, her expression sharpening. "And guess where they're going? Small organizations with vague descriptions, community initiatives, local improvement groups, dead ends for most people, but not for us." Morgan's voice was firm. "We've already tied him to Tank's crew. If we dig deep enough, we'll find the link to the other gangs." Reyes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're going to need more than suspicious payments and speculation. We need direct testimony, evidence that ties Hendrik to these crimes without a doubt." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Then we lean on Tank. He cracked once. If we push him, he'll give us more." The interrogation room felt colder this time. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the tense silence as Morgan and Reyes faced Tank again. His once defiant posture had sagged under the weight of his situation. The fire in his eyes dimmed to wary calculation. Morgan placed a file on the table and slid it toward him. Inside were the same photos and reports Reyes had shown her earlier, but a new page sat on top, an arrest report for one of Tank's younger crew members. "Your boy rolled over," Morgan said, her tone even. "He gave us everything we need to connect you to Hendrik." Tank's lips pressed into a thin line, his fists clenching on the table. "He's lying." Morgan didn't flinch. "You sure about that? Because if you're the last one standing, you're the one taking the fall. Hendrik isn't coming for you. You know that." Reyes leaned forward, his voice softer but no less firm. "Help us build the case against Hendrik, and you'll still have a chance. Don't, and you'll be buried under a laundry list of charges." Tank's jaw worked as he wrestled with the decision. The seconds stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally he exhaled sharply. "All right," he muttered. "What do you want to know?" Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Everything. How he funds you, how he communicates, the other crews he's tied to. You talk, or you go down alone." Tank nodded reluctantly, his voice low. "It's all through his businesses. Construction companies mostly. He launders money through contracts and pays us through fronts. We're supposed to keep it quiet, but sometimes things get messy." "The other groups?" Morgan pressed. Tank hesitated, then nodded again. "Yeah, there's a few. Same setup. We don't work together directly, but we all know the deal. Keep people scared. Keep them out of his neighborhoods." Reyes scribbled notes furiously, his pen scratching against the paper. "And how does he communicate with you?" Morgan asked. "Through middlemen," Tank said. "Guys who handle the money and pass along instructions. I've met Hendrik maybe twice. He doesn't like to get his hands dirty. Names, Morgan demanded. We need names. Tank rattled off a list of names and locations, each one more incriminating than the last. By the time he finished, Reyes looked up, his face grim but determined. This is enough to start. We'll cross-check everything. If it holds up, we've got him. Tank slumped back in his chair, the fight drained from his body. You think this is over? He muttered bitterly. Hendrik has people everywhere. You won't touch him. Morgan stood, her expression cold. Watch me. Chi-Chi. Back in the operations room, Morgan and Sarah reviewed the new information Tank had provided. The list of Hendrik's middlemen created a clear trail, and Reyes had already dispatched teams to track them down. The net was tightening, and Hendrik's once untouchable image was beginning to crack. This is it, Sarah said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and determination. We're finally getting somewhere. Morgan nodded, her focus unwavering. He's not invincible. He's just been playing the system, and now we're going to take it apart. The crowded precinct conference room buzzed with activity. Officers, prosecutors, and investigators pored over files and reports, the evidence building a damning case against Hendrik. Reyes stood at the front, addressing the team. Hendrik's operation has been carefully built to avoid detection, but we finally have enough to make our case. Thanks to Tank's cooperation, we have names, payment trails, and testimony linking him to multiple hate groups operating in the area. Kitutuns, one of the prosecutors, a sharp-eyed woman named Simmons, flipped through the files in front of her. We need to make sure this sticks. Hendrik is well connected, and his lawyers are going to argue that none of this ties him directly to the crimes. Tank's testimony is our strongest link. Morgan sat back, her arms crossed, her mind already racing. The evidence was damning, but she knew Hendrik's influence wouldn't be easily dismantled. This was the moment that would decide everything. Let's make it count, she said firmly. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor Simmons began, her voice steady and deliberate. The defense would have you believe that Paul Hendrik is a respected businessman, an innocent pillar of the community who has been unfairly accused. But let me remind you, this case isn't built on the word of just one man. It's built on undeniable evidence. Simmons paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the jury. We've shown you the financial records, she continued, gesturing toward the table stacked with binders and printouts. Money flowing from Hendrik's companies into shell accounts, then into the hands of hate groups that terrorized innocent people. We've presented communication logs connecting Hendrik to his middlemen, who passed along his instructions to the likes of Tank and his crew. She turned, pointing toward Tank, who sat at the witness table, his shoulders slouched but his testimony still fresh in the jury's minds. And yes, we heard from Mr. Tank, a man with a criminal past, a man who made mistakes, but also a man who had the courage to tell the truth. His testimony wasn't just words, it was corroborated by the paper trail, by the communications, and by the undeniable pattern of Hendrik's actions. Simmons took a step closer to the jury, her voice softening, but no less powerful. This case isn't about one man's desperation or one businessman's reputation. It's about a network of fear and intimidation, orchestrated by Paul Hendrik to benefit him financially and socially at the expense of vulnerable communities. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury filed out to deliberate. Morgan sat in the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching Hendrik. His calm facade had cracked, his fingers drummed the table, and he whispered furiously with his lawyers. Sarah leaned in, whispering to Morgan, They can't ignore the evidence. It's airtight. Let's hope the jury agrees, Morgan replied, her gaze fixed on Hendrik. Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent, save for the rustle of papers as the judge asked the foreperson to stand. Have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreperson replied, her voice steady. The tension was unbearable as the verdict was read. On the charge of conspiracy to commit hate crimes, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrik, guilty. A collective breath seemed to escape the room. Morgan's grip on the edge of the bench loosened, but her face remained stoic. The judge continued. The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. Hendrik's face was a mask of fury, but the sight of him being led out in handcuffs brought a quiet satisfaction to Morgan. Later, back at the precinct, Morgan stood in the operations room, staring at the now-cleared corkboard. The photos and strings connecting Hendricks' network had been taken down, but the memory of the work remained. Sarah approached, a tired but triumphant smile on her face. "It's over." Morgan shook her head, her voice low. "Not over, but we took down the head of the snake. The rest will fall apart now." Reyes entered, a rare smile on his face. "Hendricks' network is in shambles. His middlemen are flipping left and right, and the feds are stepping in to clean up the rest." Morgan allowed herself a small, weary smile. Good. People like him shouldn't be able to sleep easy. As the precinct quieted for the night, Morgan found herself sitting alone, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She thought of the neighborhoods Hendricks' network had terrorized, the people who had suffered under his schemes. This victory wasn't just for her, it was for them. As Simmons finished her closing argument, the weight of her words hung in the air. "Hate doesn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "Sometimes it hides behind a suit and a polished smile. But make no mistake, Paul Hendrick orchestrated this network of fear and intimidation. Today, you have the power to hold him accountable." She returned to her seat, her gaze unwavering, as the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The courthouse lobby was filled with quiet tension as Morgan paced back and forth, her thoughts a whirlwind of evidence and testimony. Sarah leaned against the wall, watching her with concern. "You've done everything you could," Sarah said softly. "It's out of your hands now." Morgan didn't respond. She knew Sarah was right, but the waiting gnawed at her. Finally, a court officer stepped into the lobby. "The jury has reached a verdict." Morgan and Sarah exchanged a glance, then followed the crowd back into the packed courtroom. The air was electric with anticipation. Paul Hendrick sat at the defense table, his face a carefully maintained mask of calm. But Morgan noticed the tension in his clenched jaw and the way his eyes darted toward his lawyers. The jury foreperson stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide Hendrick's fate. The judge addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. The courtroom held its collective breath as the foreperson began. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit hate crimes, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrick, guilty. On the charge of funding and organizing criminal networks, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrick, guilty." For a moment, there was silence. Then a murmur spread through the crowd, a mix of relief and tension, breaking at last. Hendrick's calm facade cracked, his face twisting with barely concealed rage as the judge began to address sentencing. Outside the courthouse, Morgan stood on the steps, the crisp evening air filling her lungs. Reporters swarmed the building, their voices and cameras creating a chaotic buzz. Sarah joined her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You did it," she said. "He's finally going to face justice." Morgan didn't smile. Though the weight on her shoulders felt lighter, the gravity of the moment remained. "This was just one battle," she said quietly. "There are others like him out there, and you'll deal with them too," Sarah said firmly. "But for now, this is a win." Reyes approached, his expression tired but satisfied. "They're recommending the maximum sentence," he said. "Hendrick won't see the outside of a cell for a long time." "Good," Morgan replied, her voice resolute. "That's where he belongs." The evening settled into quiet as Morgan reflected on the day's events. Hendrick's empire of fear and hate was dismantled, piece by piece, but the fight was far from over. Later that night, she sat in the park where it had all started. The bruises on her ribs were healing, but the memories of that confrontation were still vivid. She thought about Tank's crew, their misguided hatred, their attempt to make her a victim. They had underestimated her, and in doing so, had set off their own downfall. Behind her, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. Morgan stood, her breath steady for the first time in weeks. Justice had been served, and though her work was far from over, for now, it was enough.